So you can't really think about finance and investing without understanding the current geopolitical environment. It impacts so much of what we do, and how very appropriate as we all reflect on the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And as we think back, World War II was the greatest geopolitical crisis of modern times. And we hear a lot about the challenges in the world today, and while they're very significant, I think the events of June 6, 1944 really put things into perspective. Nick Burns, Richard Haas, Jeb Bush, and others have spoke at this conference in the past, and our next speaker continues that tradition of excellence in the field of geopolitics. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Meghan Sullivan. Her extended biography is in your program, and you can take a look at it. She is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and the Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her presentation today is going to focus on the intersection of energy and geopolitics because it's really hard to separate the two. She's an accomplished academic and author. In fact, her third book, called Windfall: How the New Energy Abundance Upends Global Politics and Strengthens America's Power. It was recently released. She's been a trusted advisor to presidents and senior policymakers on matters of national security, as she's helped drive important outcomes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Northern Ireland. If you read the background in the program, you'll find that not only is she very thoughtful about these things, she actually rolls up her sleeves, goes in country, and helps solve some of these problems. She spent 2 years in Iraq during her service under the Bush administration. She's been awarded the Defense Department's highest honor for civilians, the Distinguished Public Service Award, and has 3 times been awarded the State Department's Superior Honor Award. Dr. O'Sullivan earned a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and a master's of science in economics and a doctorate in politics from Oxford University. I give you Meghan O'Sullivan.
Good afternoon. And thank you, Dan, for that introduction. I was going to give you a hard time because I thought if there's anywhere in the world where people shouldn't drop the O to my name, it should be Boston College. But then we got it back, which is a good thing. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today. I hear you've had a fantastic day. It's a pleasure for me, in part. My mom is a Boston College alum, so she's very proud that I'm here today. But I also think in many ways, or I'm hoping, that you are my ideal audience. And the reason for that is because, as Dan mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about energy and geopolitics. And often I speak to audiences really interested in geopolitics or really interested in energy. And I find that fewer than I would expect actually represent the Venn diagram where these two things overlap. And this is the space that I like to inhabit and that I think is so critical. Often I'm making the argument to people that you cannot understand what's going on in the world if you're only wearing one of those lenses. If you're only wearing a foreign policy lens or you're only wearing an energy market lens. And so I think I have an audience of people who probably look at the world wearing both. So it is a pleasure to speak to you, and I'm going to forego my usual spiel, which focuses on trying to convince you that actually looking at the world, both from a market and policy perspective, is essential, and actually talk a little bit more in depth about the world of energy and what we've seen over the last decade and what we may see over the next decade. Now, I think we can all agree that the last decade was an amazing decade in energy. Many people who follow this closely say that the last decade was the most interesting decade in energy in the last 100 years. Other people say it was the most exciting decade since the advent of oil. Whatever your lens, it was a fascinating time where we can all agree that many things were at work. There was a lot going on, which is always the case, and it always comes together in an outcome that is not quite predictable. But what I want to begin by saying is that I think we could probably agree that there were a few factors that really were the stars of the last decade. They really were the things that stood out when we take a moment and we look back at this tumultuous decade of energy and we say, what were really the dominant driving factors? The first one, I'd say, is supply. So when we were having conversations about what's the price of oil, what's going to be the impact on the global economy, all of those things, we talked about supply when we were talking about where supply and demand were going to meet. Supply was the big uncertainty. It was the thing that there was the most action happening. And I'm talking primarily about oil, but of course we saw new supplies of energy, new sources of energy come online and become commercial during this past decade. But returning to oil, we see that over this decade, a really steady climb in the oil that came online. And what's even more interesting about this supply is that the most dramatic supply story was in non-OPEC markets. And that, of course, is a big change from previous decades. And if we look at just the last few years of the last decade, we see that it's actually non-OPEC supply that's meeting all of incremental global demand. Again, a very different story. So supply, really one of the main stars of the past decade. The next one, I would say, technology and markets. Now, this is not to say that politics and policy didn't have a role, but technology and markets are really the things that are responsible for the supply boom that I was just talking about. We all are well aware of what happened in the United States, and that story, the one that has a lot to do with fracking, was largely a story about technology. How people who were persistent and dedicated to figuring out how they could use technology to actually access and produce commercially vast quantities of oil and gas in the United States that people have long known were there, but they never thought it would be possible to access that oil and gas in a commercial way. So the story, of course, there's some elements of government that is part of that story, but in general, this was really a decade where technology was the driver of change in energy markets. And this, of course, is less true in renewable energies, but also technology is a big part of that story. The third star, I would say, of the past decade in energy was this new idea, this new theme of energy abundance. This is now a familiar phrase. But really, if we were sitting here 10 years ago, we would probably be talking about energy scarcity. You're all familiar with the idea of peak oil, and maybe at various points throughout your career, you thought seriously about what the prospects of peak oil were for global markets and for the global economy. And if you're like me, you're a foreign policy person, you spent a good part of the last previous decades thinking about, well, to what extent could peak oil create major schisms in the international system? So for instance, the German military did a study about the consequences of peak oil. This is back in 2006, where they concluded that peak oil could actually be a threat to the foundation of democracy in Europe. Because this whole idea, the world running out of its most important energy source before there were any alternatives. This was a pretty destabilizing prospect. And if you talk to the US military, you would find that they anticipated and they planned for multiple scenarios in which the US and China would come into some kind of conflict over scarce resources. One of my colleagues, when I worked in the White House under the Bush administration, said to me in 2006, Meghan, there's no scenario I can play out for you where the US and China will not be in conflict over scarce resources in the future. And then, of course, this peak oil idea, this idea of limited oil, limited energy, and the prospect of the world running out of it also has been a big driver of the power that Gulf countries, that Persian Gulf countries have had over the last decade. So peak oil and this sense of energy scarcity really drove a lot of things. I would say we can certainly talk about Chinese foreign policy. If we need one lens under which we understand Chinese foreign policy of the 90s and 2000s, I would definitely say it's the lens of energy scarcity. As China grew more quickly and grew in a more energy intensive way, it became more and more obsessed with the need to get energy, and oil in particular, from abroad. And so most of China's interactions in those 2 decades outside of its borders have a common theme of trying to secure energy, either through market mechanisms or more often than not through non-market arrangements. So again, we've moved very dramatically, and I would say quite seamlessly, to a world where we're all comfortable with this idea of energy abundance. And that very much was and is still part of our energy reality of this decade. And again, this is abundance in oil and gas. The United States alone, because of the technologies I just mentioned, saw its proven reserves double in the last decade, mostly on the account of these new technologies. But it's not only oil and gas, it's also solar, wind, and other forms of energy. And then the last thing that I would say is really a characteristic of the past decade is muted geopolitics. Now, as a foreign policy person, I am the last person to really credibly make the argument that politics, geopolitics, don't matter. And in fact, they did matter throughout that decade, but really not as much as we thought. I had multiple conversations over the course of the decade. And in writing my recent book, I visited 25 countries, and I spoke to people about the overlap between energy and geopolitics. And on many occasions, people would say, you know, are we in a new world where actually geopolitics and energy markets are divorced, or let's say at least separated? Think about the Arab Spring. Think about the revolutions in the Middle East in the early part of this decade, and how much political chaos that brought to that part of the world. That was clearly the end of a major era in the Middle East, the most energy-rich part of the world. Yet during that whole period, we saw stable oil prices. Now, for reasons we can talk about, kind of strange coincidences that made that possible, but again, the last decade, I'd say, is one where geopolitics mattered, but probably a lot less than we anticipated. Okay, so I'm making the case that the last decade, as exciting as it was, really these things were the dominant drivers or the big stories of that decade. Now the question is, what can we learn about this next decade? And one thing I discovered as a policymaker, but I know it's not limited to policymakers, is that it is a common mistake to think about the past as being a great indicator of the future. And that often the future is going to be very different than the past, and it's only in retrospect that we realize there was a very significant break. So let's take this moment and say, okay, we've had this transformative decade in energy and its implications for economic growth and global affairs. What about this next decade going forward? And when I do that exercise in preparation for coming to speak with you today, I really think that there's a very strong case that the stars of this next decade are actually going to be different than the 4 ones I talked to you about. So the first will be the issue of demand. Now, the demand story, I think, is front and center today and in the last few days. And if we look at the oil price, and we see that yesterday the oil price dropped by $1.80. And why is that happening? That is happening because of people's fears about global growth that have been particularly heightened in the face of the trade tensions between the United States and China, and between this possibility that the United States may impose tariffs on Mexican goods beginning on Monday. And so we saw that the IMF just this past week released some new numbers, some new projections of global growth, and then they brought down those projections. They brought them down not from last year, but just from January, where they had brought them down again. And so saying that in January, the IMF thought the world was going to grow at 2.9% this year, now, as of June, based on the data that they have from the last few months, they're saying it looks more like 2.6%. And they're revising that growth projection is actually not because they've revised the Chinese and the US growth projections. It's because they have realized that the trade tensions in those countries have actually had major implications for other countries around the world. So we see the knock-on effect already, and that is without the threatened $300 billion worth of additional tariffs that may come into place, or rather tariffs on $300 billion worth of goods, or without the Mexican tariffs. So right now, we see that yes, the world is focused on demand when it comes to energy, and this nervousness that a slowdown in global growth will have major negative implications for energy global demand growth, and obviously that will have implications for price. So that's something that's on our radar now. But I have a concern about demand that actually, predates the trade tensions. Let's just pretend that overnight we could get rid of those trade tensions. I would say we still need to be worried about demand. And the reasons for this is, and some of you may be well aware of this may be the area that you work in, but some of this is because there are just two very different pictures about the future of energy demand, and in particular, oil demand out there, in two communities that actually should be very closely in tandem in how they view the future if things are to work well, let's say, going forward. Let me explain what I mean. The first community, and the nice thing about being an academic is that you can spend your time with all kinds of different people and get the benefit of hearing their perspective. So recently, in the last actually week, I was in Calgary, and I was talking with producers, oil producers in Calgary. And I've recently been in the Middle East and talking to producers there, but government producers, and asking them what they see as the projections for oil demand going forward. And their responses are largely similar. They're not really worried about it. They look at the world and they think about all the demand that can be pent up and unleashed in emerging markets. And they even point to the projections of something called the International Energy Agency and say, look, it's not just demand in transportation and other things that we're familiar with that will drive up oil demand. It's growth in petrochemicals. That's going to be a huge driver of oil demand. So whatever the reason, you have producers, state and private ones, thinking we're pretty comfortable that demand at some point in the distant future, it'll become an issue. But when I asked the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia this question, he said, up until 2040, we're pretty comfortable that oil demand is going to continue to rise. And after that, maybe it just starts to slow. This is one picture. But if you talk to the investor community, which I did, I was visiting people on Wall Street last week and in Europe previous to that, talking to the investor community, there's a very different view. And some of this is driven by the new ESG movement. But if you talk to the investor community, they're saying, we're really worried about oil demand. And we're pretty convinced, we don't know exactly the point at which oil demand is going to start to flatten out, but we're pretty convinced it's in the foreseeable future. And it will be because of new policies around climate, new pressures from shareholders. It will be around new technologies and new efficiencies. And so they're thinking, they're less and less interested in seeing investment flow into these productive oil sectors. So I see this major cleavage between these communities, and I know that it's going to have particular consequences for our economies and probably, well, certainly for energy markets, but also our economy. So what's the second issue that I think is really going to drive things? So demand more than supply, and I would say politics and policy for the decade going forward more than technology and markets. Obviously, technology and markets still going to be a big part of the story, but I think there are several reasons why this decade going forward, we're going to be focused and fixated a lot more on the impact of politics and policies on energy markets that we were in the past. So let me just give you 3 reasons. The first is protectionism. And the fact that protectionism is on the rise, and I would say it's here with us to stay for some time. We've all heard President Trump say, I'm a tariff man. And if we look at the evolution of his political views, one of the things that has been constant has been his aversion to free trade or his skepticism of free trade. So I think certainly in the Trump administration, we're going to continue to see tariffs used not just for trade negotiations, but as a foreign policy tool. This, I'm sure, as we saw from the reaction of Lighthizer, this is not going to be welcomed by trade negotiators, but I think that's here to stay. But I would say if we focus on President Trump, we're missing the bigger picture. So even when President Trump is no longer in office, I think protectionism is going to be part of our new reality, because it is an outgrowth, not just of President Trump's views on trade, it's an outgrowth of the new populism, which is defining American politics, European politics, and even rising its head in some parts of Asia. And basically, trade has become much more politicized than it has or it was in the last decade. And it has basically become one of the reasons why people feel there is such inequality. The conversation about trade today is totally different than it was just a few years ago. A few years ago, you could feel pretty comfortable that most people would buy into the agreement that everyone becomes wealthier when there's more trade. And that, in fact, I think can be proven with facts. But now we're much, and I think rightly so, focused on the reality that while on the whole everybody's richer, the distribution effects are very uneven. And that many societies, including the United States, have not done a particularly good job at figuring out how to smooth the inequities that can arise from trade. And that is going to be something that we have not begun to deal with, and that is going to continue to be with us. And I would argue that is going to even increase. And the reasons for this is because of the growth and the march of technology. If you look at surveys about people who have lost their jobs in the manufacturing sector, you have most of them attributing their job loss to trade, and often to trade with China. But the reality is that more than a majority of those jobs are being lost or made redundant because of technology and automation. And it is simply the fact that people find it much more satisfying or convincing or compelling to blame their job loss on trade with China than on something like automation. And we know the march of automation is on its way, and we're going to continue to lose jobs in that way, and trade will continue to be the scapegoat for that. So again, protectionism and decreases in trade and those effects on global growth, and of course, that boomerangs onto energy markets for sure. The second of my three reasons why politics and policy are going to matter more in this next decade has to do with the foreign policy tool of sanctions. It's related to protectionism, related to tariffs, but it's a distinct foreign policy tool, and it's one that in general has become more popular since the end of the Cold War, but it's become even more popular in the Trump administration. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that the Trump administration, I think President Trump in particular, is more comfortable using elements of economic coercion to pursue policy goals than it is using hardcore diplomacy or the hard work of development aid, those other tools that we traditionally turn to try to achieve objectives. So there's a quicker reaction, a quicker impulse to use economic coercion, and sanctions, of course, is right up there as a key tool in your economic coercion box. The second thing is that in the last few years, as many of you know, the US has gone from being very heavily reliant on energy from abroad to being an exporter of crude oil and an exporter of liquefied natural gas. And not just a mild exporter, we're talking about a very significant exporter. We are still importing oil from other parts of the world, Canada, Mexico, hopefully that will continue, Saudi Arabia to some extent. We're still importing, but we are exporting a lot more, and it looks like in the next year or so we might become a net exporter. And we are exporting more, let me just give you some numbers to give you a sense. We are exporting more oil, more crude oil, than the United Arab Emirates produces. We're exporting more oil than Venezuela was producing before its crisis. And on liquefied natural gas, the US is on track to become the third largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, behind Australia and Qatar. So again, we're coming on to the energy scene as an exporter in a big way. And the Trump administration has, as I think any administration in this situation would, been looking for how it can translate that energy prowess into geopolitical heft. And they're doing it through the use of sanctions and through the use of energy as a foreign policy tool, sort of threatening access to exports or offering exports as a political carrot. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. Obviously, that can affect trade numbers very directly, but there are two other things that could happen. The first is that you may have other countries, and you do have other countries, but they may become increasingly successful, look for ways to try to circumvent using the dollar in trade. And so we see in relations to the sanctions on Iran that countries are thinking about how can we do trade with Iran without using the dollar so we're not subject to sanctions. China and Russia are particularly interested in this because they have a variety of goals around that. But I think our use of sanctions is really inviting more and more countries to think about that. The second thing is that the United States has always considered itself to be energy secure because of the free functioning of global energy markets. You know, we've never been a country, even going back to World War II, we've never been a country where we thought we had to have physical control over all this oil. That's why I get into these long conversations with people about why the war against Iraq was not about oil, and I'm happy to do that, but I'll leave that for the moment. It's not that the United States wants to physically control energy. It has been most interested in ensuring that there is a free-flowing global energy market where markets can work and they can deliver energy. And this, I think, is going to increasingly be challenged by America's own use of sanctions. And then lastly, the third reason why politics and policy are going to matter so much in this coming decade has to do with climate. We have had a lot of talk about climate in the last decade, some policy action, backwards and forwards. I think the next decade globally, but also in the US, is definitely going to be one of climate action. And there's a couple of reasons for this, neither of which will surprise you. The first is just the growing sense of urgency. When people first started talking about climate change, we probably all can remember when that was. We had a sense that this was a problem that was going to become tangible in the age of our children or our grandchildren. We were talking about a problem that we didn't think was really going to manifest itself for potentially 100 years. Now we realize that actually the timeline is much shorter. The international or the intergovernmental panel on climate change, which is a panel of dozens of the world's top climate scientists, came out with a report at the end of last year saying, actually, the temperature at which and the timeline under which we are at risk of very serious climate crises has moved to 2040. And that is, I think, within the lifespan of everyone in this room. So that's going to change the politics, but it also changes a sense of urgency. The second reason why I think this decade will be much more about climate is because climate is a generational issue. I've heard that you recently, or I'm not sure if recently is the right word, but you've heard from Jeb Bush in the past. I had the pleasure of working on his campaign, and we talked a lot about climate. And one of the points that I was making repeatedly was climate was not a Democratic or Republican issue for the millennial generation or for people under 30. I still believe if you are under 30, if you want the votes of people under 30, you have to be serious about climate change. And increasingly, people who think and look at the world this way are becoming of age to be in politics, to influence politics, and to be decision makers. And so I think that is going to affect things. Okay. The different cast for the next decade. I talked about energy abundance and how that pretty dramatic shift away from energy scarcity to energy abundance was something that really defined the last decade. We're still going to hear about energy abundance. If anything, we're going to be in a more and more energy abundant decade. But I think the dominant narrative is actually going to be one of energy transition. And this is the transition away from a fossil fuel-based global economy to a global economy that relies much more heavily on environmentally sustainable energy sources. So this is going to be, as I said, the dominant narrative in the energy world going forward. And I would say this is going to be a massively disruptive narrative. So if we take a moment just to think about all the disruption that happened from this movement from energy scarcity to energy abundance, or just of what happened as a consequence of what we call the unconventional revolution, this increase in oil and gas on account of fracking. And keep in mind that this is mostly a phenomenon that happened in North America, not even so much in the rest of the world. So just that change, more oil and gas on global markets, was hugely disruptive. It was hugely disruptive to the way that oil markets worked. And if anyone's interested, we can talk more about how basically OPEC's business model was completely upended by this energy revolution in the United States. And we've seen how OPEC has struggled to maintain its relevance, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that the way that oil is produced now in the United States really calls into question the timeline under which OPEC had been making its decisions over the last 60 years. So we had a huge disruption in energy markets and huge disruption in geopolitics. Think about what's changed in geopolitics just because of this unconventional revolution in oil and gas. The United States, again, became an energy superpower, and with that has come more American hard power and more American soft power. It also, this unconventional revolution, because it changed the way the oil markets work, actually also was and is one of the biggest reasons why Gulf countries, Middle Eastern countries, have adopted major economic reform programs and are committed to them, or at least try to remain committed to them. This energy revolution actually brought Russia and Saudi Arabia closer together in a way that couldn't have been anticipated by anyone in the foreign policy community just a few years ago. And for China, this has had all kinds of implications. As I mentioned earlier, energy scarcity was a driving force behind Chinese foreign policy. And in this new world, China has more scope, more ability to address other kinds of issues in its foreign policy. And so I would say it's really lubricated China's rise to the world stage. So if you think about how disruptive just the increase in oil and gas has been, think about how disruptive a whole new energy system is going to be. Because this energy transition is not just about more of one kind of energy. This is about a totally new energy system. And if you think about, I'm going to just give you 3 reasons for the disruption. First, as I said, it's going to be a much larger disruption. If you look at the statistics of the International Renewable Energy Agency, they expect that if the world is actually going to move to a situation where it meets its climate goals, that the world will need to invest $29 trillion more in energy infrastructure than it is currently planning to do right now. That's a huge amount of money. It's not clear where it's going to come from. But again, that's to create a new energy system. It's also, this energy transition is going to be so disruptive because there are huge uncertainties around it. Of course, nobody knows exactly what the world will look like if, in fact, it is able to make this transition to a more sustainable energy mix. We don't even know if fossil fuels will still be relevant or not. Now, if we look at these projections of scientists, we see in the not so distant future, like 2050, the world has to be operating on a zero carbon energy foundation. Now, that isn't possible with fossil fuels, all of which have varying amounts of carbon associated with it, but it might be possible if technologies dedicated to the development of carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and use actually bear fruit. And there are some people who are banking on that, thinking we're still going to be able to use coal, natural gas, and oil because we'll have this technology. So we don't even know if the sources that are currently providing the world 81% of its energy today will be relevant in this new transition. And even fuels that we think we can depend on, or we think we know what their future looks like natural gas, which is a much more friendly fossil fuel when it comes to carbon, we don't really even know what their particular stance is going to be, because renewables might catapult natural gas out of the line of succession. Or take nuclear. The different projections, we can see that in some cases, nuclear power may grow by just 41% over the next several decades, and in others, it might grow by 88%. So there's huge uncertainties about some very basic things. And then the final reason I would say is this is going to be a more disruptive narrative because it's going to take a lot longer. So this unconventional revolution that I talked about in the last decade, it really, unless you were someone who was working on the fracking technology for decades, and that's not most of us, it really happened quite quick. We saw these dramatic changes within the span of a decade. This energy transition is going on, has been going on, and will continue to unfold for decades. And the issue with this in terms of uncertainty, it means that there's plenty of opportunity for us to mistake signals, to misinterpret signals, and to think that we're going to make investments, we're going to make business decisions, we're going to make policies, believing that the world is moving in one direction, when in fact, the world might be moving in another direction. And I think oil demand is maybe the easiest example to imagine. You had in 2013 and 2014, people thinking, actually the world is about to reach peak oil demand, because we saw a flattening and even a little decline in global oil demand growth. That proved to be fleeting, but for about a year, people were starting to think about how should this change their policies. And I think my prediction is that happens at least 2 more times within the next decade, that we think it's happening, it turns out it's not happening, and then it really will happen, and who knows if we'll recognize it. So a lot of reasons for the uncertainty. And then the last thing that I want to mention that will be different about the decade going forward than the decade we've just had. I talked about muted geopolitics of the last decade. I think this is a decade of geopolitical resurgence. This is a decade where geopolitics are really, really going to matter when we look at energy markets and obviously the implications for global growth. And I have 3 reasons I'll put on the table for you. The first 2 that can be no surprise. The third one is the one that I think is actually most important. So the first reason is that we're probably going to have, or we may have, tighter oil markets. And if we have tighter oil markets, that means if there's some kind of disruption, then we're going to see, we have some kind of disruption, we're going to see it reflected in price a lot more quickly. It's going to look a lot more like the previous decades. I think that is likely to happen, but that's not my biggest concern. Secondly, we're in a world where actually the list of geopolitical challenges is quite daunting. And as someone who's been doing foreign policy for 25 years, I can tell you that this list is pretty daunting. We could talk about Iran, and I'll just touch on these briefly, but I'm happy to talk about any of this in greater detail when I open it up in a few minutes. So Iran, we've seen efforts over the last couple of days to try to bring down some of the tension that has built between the US and Iran. However, I think as somebody who worked on the Middle East for a long time, as Dan mentioned, I lived in Iraq for 2 years, I'm very nervous about the potential for miscalculation in the Gulf right now. We have a lot of US military force in the Gulf, moved in recently in response to some intelligence. And that creates tension, but also creates opportunities for unplanned things to occur. This doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how it could play out, particularly when we're talking about Iran, which is a country that has a military structure, command and control that does not resemble that of the United States at all. There are lots of paramilitary groups, and they are not taking direction directly from Tehran. And it's a pretty inviting target to have a lot of US naval forces in the Gulf. Certainly, it doesn't defy one's imagination to think that one of those forces could create some kind of situation that the Trump administration would feel it had to respond to with kinetic force. not necessarily the same thing as a war, but kinetic action in the Gulf, something we want less of, not more. There's also a date that isn't, I think, hardly on anyone's radar, and that's July 7th. That's the date at which the timeline that the Iranians have given to the Europeans expires. Basically, the Iranians said to the Europeans, we're going to start enriching uranium again, basically, which is the most problematic part of Iran's once nuclear program. We're going to start enriching uranium in 60 days unless Europe compensates us for the damage that American sanctions are being done to our economy. I don't think there's any prospect of the Europeans actually being able to take meaningful action. Maybe they'll provide enough face-saving actions. But it's possible that we could find ourselves on July 8th with Iran announcing that it's going to enrich uranium more, and we could quickly find ourselves back in the 2012 conversations where we are talking about the possible use of American or maybe even Israeli military force against Iran to keep it from gaining a nuclear weapon. Venezuela. Venezuela is a case, a real tragedy, as you well know, and a case that has had a massive impact on oil markets over the last 3 years because of the huge decline in Venezuelan oil production over the last few years. Venezuela is almost to the point, for reasons I could go into more detail, almost at the point where I think it's not going to have a big impact directly on oil markets anymore. I mean, its production is so low that it is hard to imagine that it's going to go that much lower and affect oil markets. I also think the scenarios under which Venezuela brings back its oil quickly are almost zero. However, if you talk to people in Latin America, more and more people are worried about Venezuela's ability to destabilize the continent more generally. We know the huge flows of refugees that have come out of Venezuela. We know that parts of that continent are struggling with a drought. And we know that there's potential there for populist politics to rear their head. So there is the possibility that Venezuela creates another kind of geopolitical crisis beyond the one that's happening in its own borders. Saudi Arabia. Maybe someone will want to talk about this in greater depth, but a few years ago, we were all talking about Saudi Arabia. I admit I was one of those people who, in one of my trips to Saudi Arabia, had the chance to meet with the king, the crown prince, other members of the government, and I was really excited about the prospects of real change in Saudi Arabia. Here was a leader who really had a vision and who was charismatic and had a plan. This was exciting because after decades of not a lot of change in the kingdom, it seemed that the Saudi leadership really understood that Saudi Arabia's economic model was not sustainable. Now we're not talking about that so much, in part because of everything that's happened that has undermined the credibility of the crown prince as the kind of leader that the United States wants to back and the kind of leader who can deliver on many of the tough things that Saudi Arabia needs to do in the next decade. But what we're not talking about is what are the consequences of Saudi Arabia not making those big changes. And I think those are the things that increasingly need to be fed into our global projections. Because Saudi Arabia's opportunity and its possibility of meeting a dramatic economic reform program that is heavily dependent on international support, I think has gone down dramatically in the last couple of years. And I think the consequences for Saudi Arabia are that in 10 years, Saudi Arabia is probably going to be poorer, more radical, and more unstable. And that, of course, is going to have big market implications and general regional and global stability. And then finally, the US and China. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. But we are not just in a trade battle with China that has some prospect of being resolved in the coming weeks or months. We are actually, I like to say that China is really the only bipartisan foreign policy issue I can think about right now. Because you have people across the political spectrum agreeing on the need for a new approach with China. And that new approach doesn't end with a trade deal that simply gets China buying up more American goods. It probably ends with these two countries and their economies becoming more distinct, not completely independent of one another. But I think about just a few years ago, a friend and colleague of mine, Neil Ferguson, used to talk about this concept chimera. And that was his idea, which seemed very obvious at the time, that China and the United States were basically totally integrated and inseparable. I think those days are gone and we're moving in the opposite direction. Okay, so I said there were 3 reasons why I thought geopolitics were going to be more dominant this decade. 1, tighter oil markets. 2, we've got a long list of things that could be disruptive. And 3, and this is the one that I find most disconcerting and most consequential, and that is our reduced capacity to deal with global threats. The last many decades, and actually it being the anniversary of D-Day, as Dan said, is really an opportunity to reflect on this. But the last many decades have not been perfect when it comes to global cooperation. But I think it has been remarkable, the extent to which you have had the advanced economies and the advanced democracies of North America and Europe and parts of Asia that have operated on a common value system, that have generally shared views and opinions about when there's a need for international action, that have generally bought into a set of institutions that have governed global growth and peace and prosperity over the last many decades. All of those things, I think, are at best at risk, at worst already fractured. I don't think there's arguably a common set of values among these leaders. We have a set of institutions that are still functioning, but they're not really perfectly fit for the challenges of technology, of climate change, of pandemics, those type of things. They weren't made for those kinds of challenges. And we certainly don't have a global consensus about when to act in tandem with one another. So I'm concerned that something in previous decades might have been pretty easily managed by the international community now has the prospect of creating major waves throughout the world and energy global markets, and of course the global economy. So after this talk, I think about how do I end on an upbeat note. It's a little bit hard. This is not helpful. I was like, I'm trying to think of an analogy. Maybe if the last decade in energy was an earthquake, the next one's going to be a tsunami. I don't know, tsunamis are not really upbeat either. But I do know that based on your background and the fact that you're here at this conference on finance, that we're all people who thrive and profit from, find interesting and find opportunity in uncertainty. And certainly that is my biggest message to you, is that this is going to be a huge decade of uncertainty, particularly as it relates to energy markets. But as I started by saying, energy markets have a major impact on not just global growth, but also global politics. And so I think with all the changes I've described in energy, we can expect them to reverberate throughout the political and economic systems and create opportunities and challenges for all of us in the decade ahead. So with that, it is time for me to stop and take any comments and questions, corrections, anything you would like. Thank you.
You didn't mention Russia, I don't think. Would you comment on Russia in the context of energy, supplying Europe, et cetera?
Sure. No, I did not mention Russia, and it is a big omission when you're looking at the whole globe. I actually think the story of Russia and energy and geopolitics is one of the most fascinating ones. Russia is the largest country in the world that explicitly says our national strategy is to use our energy wealth to project political power. In fact, that's what Putin wrote his master's thesis about, exactly that topic. although there is questions about whether he plagiarized it. We'll leave that aside, not for me to decide. So Russia, definitely has seen this as being its objective even before Putin, and it has achieved it in many ways. This energy abundance has really challenged its ability to do it on the natural gas front. So we have heard a lot of conversations about how American exports of natural gas to Europe are going to create opportunities to free Europe from Russian pressure that comes from natural gas. At the same time, Russia has said, truthfully, we're having the best years ever in terms of how much natural gas we're exporting to Europe. And both of these things are true. America's energy prowess creates opportunities for Europe, and Russia is still selling a lot of natural gas to Europe. What has changed is that the market is so different. America's energy prowess has meant that Russia is selling into a different market. It's selling into a market that isn't desperate for supply. So it's selling into a market where consumers have a lot more leverage than they did in the past. So now European consumers say, we're still going to buy Russian natural gas because it's the cheapest gas we can buy. The infrastructure already exists. But we know we have an alternative. We have an alternative in American natural gas, and we have an alternative in other natural gas that's coming online. So the Europeans feel like they have an insurance policy, and that makes a big difference when it comes to foreign policy. The prospect of Russia turning off the taps is no longer as threatening when you feel the consequences of that is simply that you're going to have to pay a higher price, not that actually people are going to freeze in their homes as they did in 2008. The oil story is much different, and I would say much more fascinating, less predictable. I'll be very brief on it. But basically, Putin has been able to do what he does so well, which is to translate a weak hand into considerable political gain. So basically, the low oil price, I mentioned that Saudi Arabia and Russia have become close partners, and that is that cooperation was forced by the fact that both countries were really challenged by the low oil prices of 2014 and 15 and early 16. So they began to cooperate. And so Russia, and Putin particularly, began to say to countries in the Middle East, well, I want to be more involved. I don't want to just be a partner on managing oil markets. I want to be a partner in all of your issues and concerns. And so now in the Middle East, Russia is the only country that everyone in the Middle East talks to. They don't all talk to the United States, but they all talk to Putin. So you've had a remarkable rise in Russian influence in the Middle East. And you can see that even in places like Venezuela, Russia has taken advantage of the crisis that has come there, both because of the energy low oil prices and because of the economic mismanagement. Russia, for a very modest investment, has been able to get its foot into the back door of the United States. And so I expect that we'll continue to see Russia doing that, and that these changing energy markets really create opportunities and in some cases challenges for Russia to do so.
Thank you, Dr. O'Sullivan. How would you compare clean water as an energy source to the fossil fuels and others that you've discussed in terms of a geopolitical battlefield?
Yeah, it's a great question, and when I speak to my students, I often say to them, if you want to work on an issue that's of the future but not such the distant future, in fact, it's with us to some extent already, water is really the issue to work on. There are already so many ways in which water has geopolitical implications. I mean, one really important example, what I don't know how well known it is that Syria experienced a very significant drought in the years preceding the civil war. And so you had a lot of movement, a lot of upheaval in the Syrian countryside that led to a lot of migration into cities that contributed to a lot of the social tumult and a lot of the dissatisfaction with the Assad regime. So we see ways in which drought, climate, water scarcity create geopolitical challenges. There's the age-old issue about sharing water from a river and how that has created geopolitical moments for India and Pakistan. There are also opportunities. Nepal, and don't quote me on this, I should never say that in front of a camera, but Nepal is believed to have enough potential in hydropower to address a lot of India's energy scarcity or energy poverty, but it's politics that keeps those two countries from realizing that future. And I just think, with climate change, we are going to see drought as being a major factor. That's one of the issues that people predict. I mean, we're already seeing some of it, but I think it's going to become more and more apparent. And if I had to guess where it's going to matter the most in terms of geopolitics, I would say in Europe and migration. 2 days ago, I was in the UK, poorly timed trip. At the same time President Trump was there. It was virtually impossible to get around anywhere in London unless you were willing to walk. But I mean, people are focused on the migration issue, obviously is a big driver of Brexit, but of European politics in general. And just the drought that is anticipated in parts of Africa is going to create a lot of climate migrants. It's really, really going to test Europe in a way that they haven't yet been tested. And we've already seen a lot of political changes on account of that. I could go on. Thank you.
Thanks very much for being here, and also thank you for all the work you did 20 years ago with helping to achieve peace in Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. Obviously, that's coming front and center again.
Yeah.
And with the probability of a hard Brexit has obviously increased dramatically, and that seems like the more likely outcome at this point. And when you see that, and you see, Europe's obviously fraying a bit with some Italian issues and the Brexit issue. What concerns you, and what do you think of what's going to happen to Northern Ireland, to the border, with a hard Brexit?
Yeah. It's a great question, and you're defying my ability to be upbeat and optimistic, which is what I want, which is what I really would like to be. So I worked on the Northern Ireland peace process twice, right after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, in terms of trying to work with the IRA to have them decommission their weapons. And then again, I went back for 6 months in 2013 to try to negotiate a follow-on to the Good Friday Agreement. And in the first period in particular, the argument that we used with everybody who was kind of uncomfortable with the Good Friday Agreement is, look, borders don't matter anymore. Look at the direction of Europe. Everyone's becoming European. It doesn't matter what country you belong to because you all belong to Europe. And suddenly, that argument is like in deep reverse. And I think it really does undermine some of the tenets that people believed was part of the march of the progress of peace in Northern Ireland. So that's the big picture. The smaller but not insignificant picture is that while that part of the world has not fallen back into violence with a few very notable and regrettable exceptions, it is not a society at peace with itself. There are still a lot of tensions there, and I do worry about external factors sparking those. What I see as, I'll say a probable scenario, I won't say the most likely scenario. A number of things have to happen, but it's not hard to imagine them. We can imagine Boris becoming the new prime minister. That, I think, makes it more likely that there could be a hard Brexit. If there is a hard Brexit, I think there are going to be some pretty serious economic consequences. I think that leads to a new border poll in Northern Ireland. And for those of you who don't follow it as closely, part of the Good Friday Agreement was simply saying that there was the option at some point in the future to have a vote on whether Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland would be united. That option has never been exercised, in part because the changing demographics, and nobody has found it in their political interest to push for that referendum. But I think we could certainly be in a future scenario in just a few years where there's enormous pressure for that referendum to happen, and that could be very destabilizing, because obviously that will polarize a conversation that has been managed, if not resolved.
Thank you. My question has to do with nuclear power. And you touched on it when describing the fact that technologies that could extract and solve the carbon problem with oil and fossil while possible, are still in the future. And of course, there's also the people in the renewable community and people who talk about challenges around the climate and the environment. For people who think about energy, and particularly for nuclear power as a possible ingredient, what are the important trade-offs that people should think about who want to think about nuclear as an option to contribute to a solution?
Sure. Let me begin by making a kind of a bold statement, but one I think is absolutely true. If the world has any prospect of taking sufficient action to address climate change concerns, nuclear energy has to be a significant part of that effort. That I had somebody say, who I was speaking to just in the last couple weeks, if you say that you are against nuclear power, you cannot say that you are in favor of addressing climate change. These two things have to go hand in hand. And the good news is, as you may well be aware, is that the technological advances in nuclear power have made it a much, much safer energy source. I think that is not generally appreciated. So there's a big education component. You're saying what needs to be done. A big education component about how, in fact, nuclear power is much safer. To show you a little bit about what a geek I am, whenever I go to a country, I'll try to do an energy tourism thing. So I visited Chernobyl a couple of years ago. And you see the devastation that still is done and how much radiation is still coming out of Chernobyl. And you think, like, there's no prospect for this energy source. But so much has changed that nuclear power is a much safer option. However, the obstacles are pretty considerable. One, politically, look at Europe. There's still a lot of nervousness about it after Fukushima, even though that was an absolutely exceptional circumstance. Two, and I would say this is more practical, but equally pressing, is just cost. So if you think about what are substitutes, nuclear power and natural gas are like perfect substitutes if you put aside the carbon question. So they both can provide base load power, meaning they can provide power around the clock, and they're both interchangeable for all practical purposes. However, it doesn't take a lot to switch over your power plant to use natural gas from coal. But if you want to substitute nuclear power, it is extremely expensive and it takes a long time to get all the permitting. So there's huge obstacles to actually building new nuclear power plants. And we're seeing that in the United States, where it's really flatlined. Other parts of the world are actually, China in particular, are building nuclear power very aggressively. But I would say in the United States, we are definitely on a negative trajectory when it comes to these things. And this will have consequences for climate. It will also have geopolitical consequences. Other countries, Russia in particular, have discovered that many countries around the world would like nuclear power, and that this can be a foreign policy tool. This can be a tool of influence. So of the many things that Putin is doing, he is introducing countries that are interested in developing their own civilian nuclear capacity to Russian developers. And it used to be that American developers were the ones who had this market, but that is rapidly reversing itself. I'm getting the enough, Meghan, enough. But okay. I do see a 0 on the clock, but I still see hands, so, Anyway, thank you. Thank you very much.
That was great. I mean, when Meghan talks about the world, it isn't just some theory. I love, she's been in Chernobyl, she's been in Russia, she's been in Saudi Arabia. She was in Mexico talking to the vice chairman of some big bank who's apoplectic right now. I think that's the word you used. But you're around the world, and you bring all that wisdom to us. And what a great way to end the day, your perspective. I'm between Fulton Hall and Nantucket Island, and you're going around the world, and you bring all that learning to us, and we really appreciate it. That was terrific. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today, and for those who joined us last night, I hope you learned a lot, and that's what Boston College is all about, learning. We try to make the conference better every year in the spirit of ever to excel. So we can all join me now in a in a sarsaparilla or something a little bit stronger right outside that door. Thank you. Safe travels home, and go Eagles.